Well, hello everyone, and thanks for signing in for the follow-up to Harrison's very interesting talk about Kim Il-sung that we had some time ago, and he has graciously agreed to continue part two today. So he says he'd like to do it a little bit in a podcast discussion style, which of course is great. And why don't I just turn it over to you, Harrison?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to see you guys. My big 선배, all of you. So, once again, I want to say that the pioneering work that you've done, for the field of Korean studies and also helping Korea, um, you know, um, spreading the knowledge about Korea throughout the world. I mean, it's just tremendous, what you guys have done. And the fact that you guys are still in the game and so interested in Korea and Korean studies,
Still alive,
I'm
still
really
alive.
overwhelmed. Yes, yes. So thank you. Great to see you guys. So I think we can begin with the Korean War and Kim Il Sung's involvement and his um, choices of why he decided to wage this war against the South and so forth. Several things, several factors kind of created and persuaded Kim Il Sung and the leadership of North Korea in 1950. Um, and some of the things include, for example, the Atchison Declaration at the end of the 1940s, when the U.S. briefly said that if there was an invasion, a communist invasion in East Asia, that the United States will not protect Korea, and that its main interest is Japan and the Philippines. Well, always the main interest of the US has been Japan.
Yeah,
Um,
gallery.
yeah, and then protecting Korea was always a secondary mission. Not anymore, but of course, surely back then that was the case. And of course, the establishment of PRC in 1949, a tremendous global event, the victory of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, of course. And
Mhm.
so so there were some global factors that were um, creating the perfect moment for North Korea to invade. Now, but domestically, it was not a peaceful moment. There was a constant skirmishes along the border, and both sides were threatening to take over each other, take over the other side by force. And at this right moment, so the war begins in June of 1950. Early 1950, Kim is meeting with Stalin and Mao, and he received the final approval in early 1950. This was a very, very tough decision for the Soviet Union and for China as well, because these countries still very poor. The Soviet Union recovering from World War II still, and definitely not interested in fighting another war, especially with the United States. And of course, China, just barely a year old as a country, and devastated from a 20-year civil war. Now, one reason China said yes because there were a lot of North Koreans who fought with Kim Il Sung during the Chinese Revolutionary War. So in many ways, it was a sign of solidarity as well. And that relationship between Mao and Kim is something that is lasting to this day. So, the fact that Kim Jong-un was so welcomed in China just early this month, is a legacy of that relationship. So, we all know the story of the Korean War, but Kim Il-sung, one optimism that Kim Il-sung had was that if the war, an invasion begins, then there will be a major uprising in South Korea, a major uprising on his side that would eventually join the North Koreans and the communist forces. There was the major uprising throughout the late 1940s already being witnessed in South Korea, like Jeju of April 3rd, 1948, that eventually led to Masan Suncheon uprisings, and then all these partisan activities happening in all over South Korea. So Kim Il-sung was somewhat optimistic that once an invasion starts, that there will be private militias, righteous armies, and various partisan forces joining North Korea. This was also assured by Park Han-young, the second person in command in North Korea, and originally the leader of the socialist movement from South Korea. Park Han-young was a tremendous intellectual force, somewhat kind of like Trotsky of the Soviet Union. Park Han-young was the original member of the Korean Communist Party, the official Korean Communist Party that was established during the colonial period, and he is the the only high-ranking leader that studied in Moscow. He actually studied at the College of Lenin, and he was also friends with people like Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and a real socialist theorist and a philosopher, and the leader of the South Korean Workers' Party. So before there was one Korean Workers' Party, it was divided into South Korean Workers' Party and the North Korean Workers' Party, and they eventually merged to form the Korean Workers' Party in 1949. But Park Han-young was the leader of the South Korean Workers' Party, and it was that South Korean Workers' Party's branch, the Jeju branch, that also initiated the major uprising in April of 1948, which is both, I guess, it's a testament to the real power of the South Korean Workers' Party, but also a tragic feature in South Korea, because that kind of launched the whole anti-communist sentiment in Korean politics. That really began with the Jeju uprising of 1948, because it was initially launched by the South Korean Workers' Party. So it was really Park Han-young, the second man in command in North Korea, that assured Kim Il-sung that once we invade, that hundreds of thousands of partisan forces from South Korea will join North Korea. Of course, this did not happen. And the war was very devastating for North Korea and its leadership. And Park Han-young would eventually pay for, pay with his life for this responsibility, because the uprising was not enough. There were uprisings. There were leftists and socialists from South Korea on the side of supporting North Korea, but there were too few in number, and the crackdown of leftists and socialists by the South Korean government was enormous. This kind of so-called hunting for 빨갱이 사냥, right? Hunting for reds in South Korea was such an enormous effort that that the leftists and the socialists from South Korea had really no power. And then when the war ended, North Korea began to play the blame game, and all the blame went to Park Kwon-young. So eventually executed. So for having failed, right, the mission of galvanizing the South Korean population, and also convicted as a spy of the United States. So basically, it was this. Why didn't the South Korean people rise up and join us? And it's because Park Kwon-young was eventually spying for the American military. That's why he had lost all communication and power and so forth. Kim Il-sung was largely intact after the Korean War. But then in the rebuilding process, we saw signs of factionalism in North Korea that eventually would shake his power in 1956, and also a decade later toward the end of the 1960s. Now, so we commonly think that that in North Korea there really is no debate, and that the strong authoritarian style, everything is top down. But that doesn't seem to be always the case. So once they decide on a policy, then they make sure that it looks like everything comes from Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un. But getting to that policy, it seems like there's always a great deal of debate. So after the Korean War, one major debate was, okay, how do we re-industrialize the country? And one big debate was, do we follow the China model, right? Which was to prioritize the heavy industries by collectivizing and using the agricultural system to fuel the industrial growth? Or do we go to a more neutral kind of a double-sided pathway where we pay attention to both industries and consumer goods? So this was a major debate. This was a major debate after the Korean War. And this debate was also split according to factions. Yes, North Korea has always had factions. And this is not the case anymore. Or it may be the case that we do not know. But whenever we hear purges happening in North Korea, for example, the execution of Kim Jong-un's uncle Jang Song-taek early in his tenure, these are signs that there are still major factions in North Korea. We just don't know the debates anymore. But in the 50s and 60s, we still have the party documents. We have access to these documents. So we know that these debates were happening. But they were split between Kim Il-sung's partisan faction. So this Kim Il-sung's political faction were domestic socialists and the Manchurian socialists. The people who fought with him in Manchuria against Japan and their descendants. Now, on the other side were the Soviet faction. So these were Koreans who came from the Soviet Union. In the beginning, they numbered around 800 to 1,000, but it was a very powerful elite. They didn't have much grassroots support, but the Soviet Koreans were highly elite. They had connection to Moscow, and they were ideologues. ideologues, and they knew how to organize the party. So very important people. And then the other anti-Kim Il-sung faction was the Korean Chinese faction, or the Yan'an faction, the people who had participated in the Chinese Revolution. Now, they were also tremendously important because they were the military people. So the early military leaders, um, um, many of them came from this Korean Chinese faction. So the Korean Soviets were party elite ideologues, and the Korean Chinese were military people with experience in having fought in the Chinese Revolution. Now, these two factions somehow became anti-Kim Il-sung. The main reason why this was the case is because they were getting really, I guess, tired, but also alarmed, concerned of Kim Il-sung's growth of cult of personality. They were seeing that this was happening right after the Korean War in a very major way. So, Kim Il-sung and his faction publishing newspapers about the Manchurian partisans and about Kim Il-sung himself, and of course, attributing any kind of political or economic achievement to his name. So the Soviet Koreans and the Chinese Koreans began to be alarmed, become really alarmed by Kim Il-sung's growth of personality cult or glorification. And so they kind of opposed Kim Il-sung's initial drive to fund the industries with the support of the agriculture, following the China model. And they saw that the China model always did not work. So that's why the Great Leap Forward of the late 1950s eventually led to, years of famine in China. So this debate was a debate on policy, but also a division based on the fear that Kim Il-sung's power was growing too large. 1956 was the year when all these things kind of clashed. 1956 was a kind of a glorious year for the Korean Workers' Party. The Reconstruction was deemed successful because there was so much input, help, and aid coming from Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and East Germany. East Germany rebuilt an entire city called Hamhung in the northeast. It's the location of the famous Hamhung Hungnam rescue during the Korean War and so forth. So with the arrival of enormous amounts of goods and money and people, North Korea's initial reconstruction post-war period was seen as a success. And in 1956, Kim Il-sung took a almost 2-month-long trip to Europe, the Soviet Union, even Mongolia, to kind of give his thanks, right? And to make more pledges and to get more money, of course. And then during this period was when the anti-Kim faction devised up a major plot. So when he returned, he held a big meeting and he gave his report. And toward the end of this meeting, the Korean Chinese faction, the leaders of the Korean Chinese faction, people like Chae Chang-ik and Yoon Gong-hum, they went up on the stage. This was not on the agenda. And they said, Kim Il-sung's policies are detrimental to our country. We need to have a balance between industrial development and consumer goods development. And he also criticized Yoon Gong-hum. He also criticized Kim Il-sung for having built a personality cult. And this was a major surprise and attack on Kim Il-sung for the first time in the post-war period, officially attacked Kim Il-sung. Now, 1956 in February was a watershed moment in the global communist bloc. This was when Khrushchev also openly criticized Stalin for the first time in Soviet history. So Stalin died in 1953, and it took a few years, but Khrushchev in 1956, February, openly criticized Stalin for having, having ruled Soviet Union with an authoritarian power and immense cult of personality. And then from that moment, other socialist countries followed suit and began to be a little bit more self-critical about what's happening in their own countries. Because, hey, one thing that we all know about these state socialist countries is that they eventually build some kind of a leadership worship system, and there are some reasons why this is the case. There are some reasons why this is the case, and it is also a method of preservation and endurance. So in a country like North Korea, personality cult is a mechanism of reproduction of its identity and of its, to maintain its system, and so forth. So while it looks terrible, and of course, in terms of democracy, it really is detrimental. But it works. And we know that North Korea is a very stable country. And its political system is also very stable. So that is also the reason why a country like North Korea has a very long game, so maybe we can talk about this toward the end, but North Korea sees countries like the United States as very fickle, because we go through a president, every 48 years, and our policies constantly change. Whether it's the Middle East, whether it's, on China or on North Korea, they constantly change, right? So while we always say that we cannot trust North Korea, the reverse is also true from their position, because they always play the long game, the North Koreans, because their system never changes. So from them, with this long, stable system, partially fueled by, the system of personality cult, we are the more unstable government, right? So, like, including South Korea. South Korea looks incredibly unstable to North Korea. So Lee Jae-myung, he is making these positive, affirmative overtures to North Korea. Hey, let's talk, let's engage. We're here. We'll talk about everything. Everything is on the table. North Korea is saying, hey, we can trust you. We can trust you. In 5 years, everything can go back. And there could be another Yoon Suk-yeol in South Korea, which is true, right? There could very well be, because it goes up and down. The political system in South Korea is so up and down. And North Korea knows this very well. And in many ways, North Korea has decided to move on from relying um, on South Korea. So, but what do they see Trump as? Something stable. So Trump has been an influence for the past probably 10 years, in American politics. So North Korea actually sees Trump as a some sign of stability, which is so crazy to those of us living in this country or watching carefully from outside. But anyhow, so going back to the August factional incident of 1956, as it later came to be called, the August factional incident 1956. So with this statement, everything kind of was let out, and people began to openly criticize Kim Il Sung at this meeting. Immediately, with the support of the partisan faction, these guys were removed, and overnight, some of these guys, including Yoon Gong-hoon, who made the initial allegation, left the country by car and went to China. This incident was so alarming that about a month later, China's Peng Dehuai was the leader of the Chinese Korean forces during the Korean War, a very legendary leader in China. Peng Dehuai arrived in Pyongyang, and from the Soviet Union, Mikoyan arrived. So these are two top leaders who became really alarmed by what's happening in North Korea, and they had a talk. Their initial plan was to remove Kim, but then they also realized that removing Kim would have been just as difficult and probably troublesome, causing more chaos. So they demanded Kim Il Sung to make reform, especially when it came to personality cult and persecutions and so forth. After the August factional incident in 1956 and toward the end of the 1950s, there was a kind of a moment when North Korea's leadership really reshaped itself. What is very interesting is that from this moment, the Chinese Korean faction and the Soviet Korean faction actually lost more power. They began to see that this moment also coincided with the Sino-Soviet split, beginning in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and that this was also a moment that made North Korea's policymakers that either system was not really working. The Chinese system of being orthodox or dogmatic was causing a lot of suffering, and the Soviet system of initiating some kind of détente with the West and being open to capitalism. So one thing that Khrushchev did was he opened up to the United States. You know, for the world, this was a good thing. They decided to cut down the number of nuclear weapons. They decided to engage in academic exchange and so forth. To North Korea, this was a revisionistic policy. this was a compromise with capitalism. So from this moment, Kim Il-sung actually stepped up and began to talk about North Korea's own socialism and eventually juche. So it is in the lore of juche history, it is December 1955 when Kim Il-sung really begins to preach juche, and he uttered the first idea of juche in 1955. But it is really in the 1960s that this idea is developed into a more coherent body. And so this is actually the moment when Kim Il-sung consolidates his power. And through the idea of a unified identity and unified nationality ideology in North Korea, through the discourse of juche. Juche is in many ways, of course, it is entirely attributed to Kim Il-sung. It comes from him, and it is also validated through him. So his word and his ideas become the guiding force of all sectors, all parts of life in North Korea. When you look really into it, juche is not an exceptional ideology. It is not. It is a kind of ideology that was found all over the world in the post-1945 global frontiers of radicalism. So in America, we saw Black nationalism happening. And Nation of Islam, for example, is also an organization that embodied this kind of radical ideology. So what these, and of course in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's ideology was very similar to juche. In essence, juche begins with the subject, the individual subject being in control and being responsible for one's destiny. So, people have pointed out that in essence, juche shares ideas with things like liberalism, with things like pioneerism, and of course, individualism that even Americans can understand and kind of sympathize with. So, and this is perhaps why the Black Panther Party became obsessed with juche. And the Black Panther Party read and studied various small radical ideologies, arising from across the world, including, highly theoretical body of works by people like Fanon, but also Kim Il-sung. So they visited eventually, the leadership of Black Panther Party visited North Korea several times. One leader of the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver, who had a tragic ending to his life, eventually raised his daughter in North Korea. And this daughter even published a book, about her life growing up in North Korea. Anyhow, so juche is, of course, a uniquely North Korean method of using ideology, because in North Korea, juche is the guiding principle of all sectors of life. Everything from the steel industry to sports and to even personal life. to even personal life. So, there's a very famous documentary called A State of Mind by Daniel Gordon. It came out in 2004, and it's about the mass games, and it's about these two young women, teenagers, North Korea, practicing for the mass games. And these are teenagers, and they are talking about the words and the guidance of their great leader and how they are helping them practice and then become perfect so they can one day perform for the great leader and so forth. So everything from industries to something that is very personal, Juche is utilized. So that is kind of unique in North Korea. But Juche ideology and the message is not exceptional. It is a post 1945 discourse that we find throughout the world. The so-called post-colonial radical ideas that emerged from every parts of the world, including the United States. So um, so I think it might be helpful for us to think about what Juche and personality cult means. And this is something that various people, including myself, have studied. It's not easy, but here's some things that we can conclude. First, Juche ideology or personality cult is about education. So, from preschool, you're being taught that everything is attributed to the capacity of the leader. So in that respect, there is a strong religious component to it. So this is a formal aspect. A formal aspect is it is part of the official education system, and everybody in North Korea is taught about Juche and how it is directly connected to Kim Il Sung. That is absolute. That is absolutely clear. So it is part of their formal system, and they learn about it, and they learn the language of Juche. Now, second part is that it is performative. That Juche, and of course, living in a country of Juche is about following the performative protocol of Juche. So that is about how to talk about your experience, how to talk about world history, how to talk about current events, and you link everything with Kim Il Sung and Juche. So there are these two aspects: the formal aspect of education and this kind of nebulous side of performance. And this performance side is absolutely crucial because performance is real and both not real. So and it's called performance because it is exactly like stage performance. Actors, when they're on stage, they are absolutely serious. They're absolutely real. When they cry, it's real. When they laugh, it's real. And the stage, it's their life when they're performing. And the same theory kind of applies to places like North Korea. So there are even ideas like the Soviet Union and North Korea is a big theater state where performance is so much emphasized, just like theater. Because when you're on the stage, it's real. but we know that things also happen behind the curtain. So there's the front part of the stage and there's the back part of the stage. And just as actors who distinguish the two, as soon as they get off the stage, they are not performing. Same thing happens in North Korea. Or we know that there's a lot of evidence that the same thing happens in North Korea. So in official spaces, North Koreans have embodied how to talk, how to act, how to carry on certain emotional sides. And then when they are not in kind of official space, they leave the performance stage. So this is how personality cult actually works. It is never a perfect system. So this is also the reason why immediately after North Koreans defect North Korea, escape North Korea, they begin to criticize the government. So guys, this is such a phenomenal thing, but as soon as North Koreans leave North Korea, they begin to attack and criticize the leadership and the government. It is amazing. It is incredible how vicious they become criticizing North Korea. So that is why this is a very curious side. Majority of defectors who land in South Korea, they become right-wing. They become extreme right-wing. Why? Extreme right-wing politics in South Korea involves demonizing and criticizing North Korea. And they are like, oh, I'm right there. We're right there with you. It is an amazing side to, so it also reveals the fact that ideological hold is not only unstable, right? That it is always impartial, and it largely depends on performance. So I'm going to bring us to kind of a conclusion here. Let's see. The 1970s and the 1980s is also a quite a remarkable moment. Hold on, let's see. The 1970s, in many ways, is a moment when Kim Il-sung is trying to engage with the world. He knows that Juche is not always working. It is not working. No country can develop in isolation, and Kim Il-sung knows this very well because he went through the post-war reconstruction period where North Korea's true growth only happened with a lot of investment from Europe and China and the Soviet Union. And this is the same for the whole world. You need investment for your country to grow. So Kim Il-sung begins to see this in the 1970s that okay, we need more help from outside. So he begins on a global campaign. He begins with Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia with other fast developing countries. Trade, diplomacy, and initially North Korea gives a lot of aid to Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, aid in medicine, aid militarily, teachers, but also a lot of technology as well. Okay, big problem. These countries are more unstable than North Korea. So practically none of these projects actually benefit North Korea. And it's because these countries that he's trying to partner with are very unstable. Africa, Indonesia, Southeast Asia. They're going through political changes every 5 years. They are overrun by, thuggish rulers. They can't seem to build any infrastructure. So they all kind of fail. All these projects that he tries to do with Africa and Latin America kind of fail. But the legacies are quite strong even to this day. So, in Senegal, for example, in the early 2000s, North Korea helped to build the African Renaissance Monument, the biggest bronze monument in all of Africa. It is enormous. And it was North Korean engineers and technicians and North Korean parts that built this monument, the African Renaissance Monument. Please Google it. It's an enormous, enormous. North Koreans are the best statue makers in the world today. The best. No one is able to make these grand, gigantic statues anymore because nobody does that anymore. Who does that? North Korea does, and many African countries wanted to purchase these skills and parts from North Korea. So the African Renaissance Monument in Senegal, it is enormous. So the legacies are still there. So beginning in the 1980s, what North Korea tries to do is open up to the West, including the United States. He wants investment. He wants investment from American companies like Coca-Cola. He wants to borrow a lot of money from Western banks. But of course, North Korea is not immune to global economic downturns, so they eventually default on hundreds of $1 million of loans from the West. But in the 80s, North Korea passes the foreign investment law, trying to attract corporate investment from the West, including the United States. But because of global economic downturns and also North Korea's own inability to build the right infrastructure, these things never take off. And then the poverty that comes with the food shortages really devastate North Korea's economy in the late 1990s. But let me end, Frank, by sharing this wonderful photo of Kim Il-sung and Jimmy Carter in 1994. Let's see. So in 1994, at the height of the first nuclear crisis, you could say, in North Korea, but this nuclear crisis was also a moment when various countries, Japan, the US, Russia, South Korea, decided to work with North Korea. North Korea would denuclearize, but then the West would build nuclear energy power plants. And while the negotiations were failing, Jimmy Carter went to North Korea. And he kind of prevented a possible strike on North Korea by the United States. Clinton was ready. Clinton was ready to strike North Korea and take out its nuclear facilities. And then Jimmy Carter stepped in and went over there. Some of you guys probably remember Jimmy Carter very well. I was quite young when he was president, but you know, for this effort, he eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyhow, so I really love this photo. And I kind of mentioned this in my little synopsis, but so we see these two aging leaders, one and two from very, very different backgrounds. You know, you could say Jimmy Carter was a very mild and a champion of American democracy and liberalism, but also Christianity and goodwill and so forth. And you can say Kim Il-sung was a soldier who lived through a war and factionalism, political competition, a survivor, a partisan who probably also persecuted many people to retain his power and so forth. But toward the end of his life, they were trying to come together. Kim Il-sung and Jimmy Carter. In many ways, a sign that North Korea was trying to open up to the world and especially to the United States. And Kim Il-sung, at this stage of life, kind of represents the myriad of battlefronts that he was part of. Of course, anti-imperial, anti-American, and anti-South Korean, and very often sometimes belligerent leader, but also at the same time who had to lead his country and his people since 1945 through a very difficult, violent moment in history. And in 1994, when these two people came together, there was a genuine effort to reestablish some kind of connection between these two countries. It has not happened. And I will conclude, Frank, but it has not happened. But I think we have another opportunity where some kind of a brand new roadmap of engagement can happen again. Thank you, guys.
Well, thanks, Harrison. It was fascinating. Wow. Let me get to a gallery view here. I briefly tried to share the monument. I don't know, did it pop up?
It popped up, but very small.
Yeah, I know.
Oh,
I
okay.
tried to share it, but it's too small, and I don't know exactly how to make it bigger. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah. Hold on. Can I try to find it and share it?
Sure.
Just briefly.
Yeah, I did it on my phone and sent it to the computer, but it's too small. Yeah. We're a little older than you, Harrison. You know, you're way ahead.
No. Come on. Come on. Hey, you guys are still meeting over Zoom every month. This is fantastic. Let's see. Hey, but have you guys been meeting every month?
Yes.
Yes.
Twice a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a chat the first Saturday and then a presentation the third. And we take a little time off in the winter and the summer. But yeah, we've been meeting regularly since COVID, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's when I discovered Zoom because overnight we had to use Zoom, in
Yeah.
our classes. Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's
Look
come.
at this monument.
Oh, wow.
Hmm.
Yeah. It is an enormous and quite incredibly well made statue. Anyhow,
He missing something.
in Senegal. It's enormous, guys. Here's some people over here. And it's
Oh my.
Oh, gee. Wow.
yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Says
Yeah.
160 feet.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we open up things for some comments and questions? Charlie?
Yeah, I have a question. Very interesting talk, Harrison. Thank you very much. About the events of 1956, which you spoke about, and the fact that things seem to be there. There's a great amount of tension in North Korea during that year, from the way you described it, to the point where the Chinese and the Soviets were very concerned, and they came to North Korea and put pressure on Kim Il Sung and his government to make reforms. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, because the next thing you said, or maybe I missed a connection somewhere, but that's when Kim Il Sung, exactly at that time, consolidated his power, and the whole idea of Juche came along, and so this whole business of reform, I don't get it.
Yeah.
If he was being pressured to reform, what happened to that?
Yeah. Well, the reform began with getting rid of um, ideological differences. And basically, he said, we need to be unified ideologically. We need to be unified at this time. Um, uh, there were too many different factions, and this put a danger to our country. So this, in fact, was also, so the moment of crisis that he experienced was also the moment that he used to unify the people and say, hey, people like Yoon Gong-hum and the Soviet Korean faction who attacked me were um, rather narrow in their views. The Korean Chinese faction supporting China's policy, the Soviet Korean faction supporting the Soviet policy, and so forth. And we need to create our own policy, a North Korean policy. So this was also a way for him to shape a very North Korean policy guided by his own words.
But was this sort of reform that would have satisfied the people in China and the Soviet Union who were concerned about the way things were going in North Korea?
I don't think so. I don't think so. So from this moment, North Korea's relationship with China and Soviet also kind of lagged and kind of took a downturn as well. So the Soviets, the Sino-Soviet split was also bad for North Korea. Investment basically stopped toward the end of 1950s. No more grants, no more aid coming in. Definitely no more free aid. So what North Korea tried to do was seen probably as too extreme for the Soviet Union and China as well. And this was also the beginning of North Korea's economic downturn. So it took about 10 years, but toward in the 1970s, North Korea's economy really slowed down.
Dave,
Whereas in South Korea, the 1965 normalization with Japan was a major windfall economically. So they received $300 million in grant money, South Korea, that they didn't have to pay back in 1965 US dollar amount, $300 million.
Hmm.
That basically started South Korea's economic boom. And this kind of investment never happened in North Korea.
Were we part of that investment? We went in 66.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think everything would kind of run together, right? This South Korea opening up to Japan and also trying to find the U.S. market for its manufacturing goods. And then you guys came in.
I'm just wondering, we wouldn't be part of a Japanese investment, but I'm sure
No,
there must
no.
be.
Well, 1965, Park Chung-hee's policy really also opened up the South Korean market. Syngman Rhee, in many ways, was a staunch nationalist, and he was very suspicious of the U.S. and Japan, both. Although he was trained and educated and made his name in the U.S., but it was really the dictator Park Chung-hee, right, who welcomed all kinds of capital from the outside, including human capital.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Can
Yeah,
I,
David. Hey.
I just wanted to add, this isn't directly relevant, but it sort of echoes that time in 66, 67. That's when I discovered the book of Kim So-wal's poems,
Oh,
Azaleas,
wow.
translated into English by Kim Dong-sung. And I found it in a bookstore in Andong when I was just
Wow.
wandering around and saw this little book with a bright red cover.
Mm,
And I found out from various people that at that time there were no red covers. There was nothing red. Balgingi was bad. And this book had the red cover and captured my attention, and it's what got me started on Korean poetry. But what I learned later was Kim Dong-sung was a good
yeah.
friend of Park Chung-hee, and
Uh-huh.
the two of them would often go for walks in the garden at the Blue House. And I met later in 73, 74, when Ann and I went back and I was working on my dissertation, I met Kim Dong-sung and talked with him about those days
Yeah.
and the red cover. And I think quite deliberately he chose that because people would see it and nothing else read at that time. And there I was, and I was drawn in. But so many of the things you mentioned,
Yeah.
bring to mind these strange moments in sort of my encounters with Korean culture that were shaped
Yeah.
by these kind of, who knows, sort of ad hoc decisions by the leadership.
Yeah. So would you say Kim So-wol had leftist ideas?
I don't think so, no, but he was the folk song poet and
Yeah.
really, really after that, but also very much dedicated to finding a way to express sort of the commoner's experience of life
That's
and,
yeah.
went at it that way. And of course,
So you
he was from
yeah
North Korea.
yeah. Um, but he died before the division, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, he
Yeah.
died in about 1933. He was quite young. I think he was just in his 30s, and he
Mm,
committed suicide. He um, you know, failed at one thing after another. He had gone to Japan to study, but then had to come back because of the family finances and couldn't get a newspaper delivery system up and running in his province. And,
yeah.
just a terribly sad story, but beautiful, one beautiful poem after another. Why?
So do you guys recall some anti-North Korean narrative that was around in 1960s South Korea?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything about North
It
Korea
was,
was, hey,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it
I
was
mean,
very
I remember that there were the population at large was being told that they should stay on the lookout for spies, any suspicious uh, activity, anybody who said anything that was a little bit strange, that this person could be a spy and should be reported, to go to the police and tell them that, there's this suspicious guy. And that was the message that was being promulgated all around. I remember, watch out for spies. I mean,
Yeah.
it was plastered all over the walls, Pangong, Pangchop, watch
Hmm.
out, anti-communism and watch out for spies.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
that was the slogan that everybody saw every day.
Yeah, well, in my school is a boys' school, and they had military drill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So unification movement at that time was not visible, right? It wasn't happening on the streets.
Unification, you mean unification of the two Koreas?
Yeah.
Is that
Some
what
kind
you
of
mean?
통일 운동. Yeah.
Yeah, not really, not while we were there.
Mm.
No, the feeling was very clear that it was better dead than red. That if there was another invasion, they would fight to the last person.
Yeah.
Also,
Right.
it wasn't that long since the people that we came into contact with all had very, how shall I say it, very intense memories and feelings about their
Mm.
experiences of not too many years before with
Yeah.
the war,
Yeah.
and then the years immediately after that. So Korea was still, you could still see the rubble all over the place.
That's true.
From the Korean War when we were
Mm.
there. So Korea was, maybe half rebuilt by that time. I don't know how to put a measure on that, but it was still in the process of rebuilding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, the quality of a lot of what was being rebuilt at the time was
Not so
durable.
great.
Yeah.
Not so great. That's true.
When
Uh,
Harrison was talking about the purge, I always sometimes Charlie forgets this, but when Charlie went back to do his anthropological research in Charlie's village during that period, the oral
this
the
was the
legends.
70s.
Yeah, why don't you can tell it, Charlie?
I don't know what you were going to say.
Oh, okay.
You tell me.
I remember, but they came in on a truck and they read out the names of all of these. I guess this would have been during the Korean War when the village
Yes,
had
this was
been
during the Korean
taken
War.
over by North
Yeah,
Korea,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
everybody
yeah,
who had
yeah.
been forced to put their seal, to some North
Right.
Korean documents, they were all rounded up. And Charlie's story, the original story, was that the captain, the South Korean captain that was in charge of this, said, "It's a long trip. If anyone needs to take a leak, why don't you go ahead and you can come back?" And people thought that maybe he was giving people a chance to escape. But many of them did not, and they got on the truck and they were never heard from
They were
again.
never seen
Is that
again. That's
correct, Charlie?
Wow.
Yeah, no, that's true. And there was something called Podo Yongming, that the people, the reports
Yes.
of, you know about that, Harrison? And this was something that happened all across South Korea during the war. And tens and if not tens of thousands of young men were executed during these purges, and without any really good evidence that these were North Korean sympathizers.
Mm.
There was just some sort of vague notion that somehow or other they were, because
Yeah.
they had put their seals to something that they thought was going to be in their interest.
Yeah. That organization has really tragic history. Yeah. Originally, they were organized as a patriotic organization made up
Right.
of people from Northern Korea, and then they got labeled as sympathizers, and they say close to 100,000
Yeah,
members.
yeah. There's
Yeah.
something along, a very large number
Yeah.
of young men. These were young men
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
military age.
Yeah. Yeah. Really tragic.
When would that have taken place? The same period or?
This was this was during the Korean War. This
Uh-huh.
was in the early 1950s.
Right.
Yeah, when
After,
we were there, not only were the memories of the Korean War very vivid in the living population, but also the memories of the Japanese occupation was still
absolutely,
Yeah.
vivid
absolutely.
in living population. And between the two, it was, we're not going to go for either of those. Thank you very much. Uh, they viewed, I think, the North Koreans would have been, uh, as far as they could tell, similarly occupiers of not something of their choosing.
Yeah. What a tremendous moment that you guys were in. So, I mean, South Korea basically had this two mission to decolonize, still decolonize,
Yeah.
and overcome the Korean War and deal with, potential communist sympathizers. My goodness.
Yeah, it
Well,
was.
I don't know that the problem of, there was a lot of talk about communist sympathizers and this anti-communism, be careful of the of espionage. But I don't know that that was such a, I don't know how much of that was actually going on, how much
Yeah.
sympathy there was for
Yeah.
for communism in South Korea at the time that we were there, and the Peace Corps. I don't think there was very much. If there was sympathy, and certainly there was to some extent, it was very much under wraps because
Yeah.
nobody was going to admit it. I didn't know anybody, and I got to know some people pretty well, and can talk frankly with them. But I think, and they were telling me what they actually believed, that the communism was a terrible thing, and the North Koreans were horrible. They were the enemy. They remembered what the North Koreans had inflicted upon the South Korean population during the war, and there were horrible atrocities on both sides, of course.
In
But
what year? In what year did Park Chung-hee's government execute some 5 or 6 labor activists who were framed framed as communists taking orders from North Korea. And I think in retrospect, they were completely innocent and they were executed. Anybody
Yeah.
remember that? Yeah, Harrison.
Was that while we were
1966
there?
was a
I
big
don't remember
year.
that.
What
Yeah.
year?
1966 was a big year. So that's when that Revolutionary Unification Party was discovered, an underground party in South Korea, and with alleged connections to North Korea.
Really?
So purges, I mean, underground purges, it seemed like did happen throughout
Hmm.
that period. Now, were they actually tied to North Korea? There was never solid evidence. Yeah. But socialists, leftists, yeah, certainly. But did they receive orders from Kim Il-sung, like how they were portrayed? We don't know. And there's not too much evidence for that. Now, Koreans in Japan, the General Federation, Chongryun Group, we know that they did have direct connection to
North Korea, yeah.
the leadership and Kim Il-sung.
Yeah.
So, so I was just recently, I have a seminar on North Korean primary sources that I read with the group. We were just reading something from the 1970s, his Kim Il-sung's 신년사, New Year's address. And for 10 years in the 1970s, he would always mention the leader of the Chongryun group in Japan, Han Deok-soo, always thanking him for his bravery, for his, support and so forth. So that connection seems to have been quite important for North Korea. They probably received a lot of cash from Japan in the 60s and 70s.
One thing that impressed me when I was there, my faculty room was very quiet. And later, someone explained, you can't talk about anything. You don't know who's a spy for North Koreans, who's a spy for the South Koreans, who's a spy for the Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, because they were worried about that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but it was kind of just a really weird atmosphere.
Mm.
And especially after the Pueblo incident and the spies that were caught right outside my school, it got even worse. Yeah.
What city were you at?
So
Oh,
경복 중학교 중학교.
you had the privilege of teaching and living in Seoul, huh?
Frankly, I didn't consider it a tremendous privilege. I didn't want to be in the city, but that's where they
Is
put
that
me.
right?
And now, I hear other people's stories from the countryside. Well, I guess it was a privilege, but there were a lot of disadvantages to it.
A personal story that impacted our life in Korea as volunteers was that we lived with a family. We lived with a family for about 6 months, and then we moved to this other family. And we lived with them for about a year when the family told us that the father had been absent for a month or two. We hadn't seen him. And they were saying he was a banker, and they were saying that he was traveling. And then they said they were moving to Seoul. And so we would have to find another place to live. It gave us the opportunity to live out in a village past the end of the bus line. So we got to see a rural sort of environment. We were in Daejeon, not Seoul. So we're already not in the big city. But people at school seemed to understand what was going on, but wouldn't talk about it. with my family until one teacher told me that he had been accused of being a spy and he was in prison in Seoul,
Wow.
and that the family needed to be near him to take clothes and food to him. And I had the image of like Charles Dickens kind of English prisons where if you had the money and people brought you food and brought you clothes, then you could kind of survive prison,
Yeah.
but otherwise not. And I don't know,
Mm.
because it was then almost 20 years later when I revisited and got in touch, and the father had passed away by then. But that was an example of someone who probably wasn't a spy.
Yeah.
Did you find out what happened to him?
He did come out of prison and he'd lived for several years, but they remained in Seoul. So he apparently was either forgiven or exonerated or served his time or whatever it was. He was not killed in prison.
Mm.
So
Many of those who lived, who survived through the 90s were exonerated, fortunately. So beginning with Noteu, you know, I mean, you know, probably, you know, whose history is probably as bad as Chun Doo-hwan, but beginning with his presidency, many of those people were exonerated, and Kim Young-sam, of course, and Kim Dae-jung, yeah, of course.
It was
But you
amazing
can't,
how when the two of them died in the same year, I think, how the public reaction was so different. You know,
yeah,
No Teu was honored in some ways, but you know, Chun Doo-hwan was just, you know, remained a pariah.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Any last questions for Harrison? It's been fascinating,
yeah.
the talk
Yeah.
and the discussion.
Hey,
Any,
thank you. You know, this is my third time, but if you guys call me, let's do another topic about North Korea next time. Maybe like the nuclear issue or something like that. We can do
Can
another
you
one.
talk about urbanization?
Yeah, yeah. Hey,
writing
let's
a
do that
book
too.
about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's do that too.
Personally, I would find that more interesting than the nuclear issue.
Oh, okay. Hey, me too. Okay, yeah. Yeah, we can do that as well. And then I'll share a lot of photos.
Harrison, believe me, you will hear from us. We would love to have you back again. It was fascinating.
Oh,
thank
it's
you.
so lucky for me to speak to you guys at least a few times a year.
Wow. Let's give a round of applause to Harrison.
Bravo,
Thank
bravo.
you, man.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Harrison.
So much. I'm going to stop the recording here if I can figure out. There it is. Okay.
Yep.
All right.